Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon.
And my name is John Henry, and we're glad to have you tonight. We thank you for tuning in as we continue our study in the book of Leviticus, chapter 22, and verses, we left off with verse 14, so we're just going to kind of review the high points, I guess, as we go through the rest of this chapter.
You know, John, one of the things that we had mentioned in chapter 22 is we've been looking at the holiness of the priest and the requirements that God had given them in reference to their own preparation and whether they, could, what disqualified them from offering sacrifices. We talked a little bit about that, and then we also looked at the taking care of their family situation, and then that brings us down, as you pointed out, to around verse 14 and following. And in that, since we had covered a lot of that in the book of Exodus concerning the flawless the sacrifices, they were to be without blemish. And each time that we saw, John, at the end, I am the Lord your God. And that was God pointing out that he was the one in charge. He was the one that they were to listen to and to make sure that they followed those instructions. And we're going to see why in just a little bit of why these things are so important, and especially when you're looking at chapter 26 of the book of Leviticus. But notice what we're dealing with. We're dealing with really the sacrificial system and all the things that would what the blood of Christ would do, and they're broken down into these great details, and no wonder, because they were representing the ultimate sacrifice in Christ Jesus, and so they had to be without blemish. And it's a very important picture and study here in of the Old Testament writings, which really helps us to understand the new covenant that we're under in Christ Jesus.
Well, just looking at verses, take them, verses 14 through 16, simply deal with the priest, and if a priest would sin, what's he need to do? And that's what is explained in verses 14 through 16. He would have to offer a trespass or a sin offering, and the payment of a 1/5 fine for his offense. And then in verses 17 through 30, all those verses talks about acceptable animals for the different sacrifices that God required. Like you said a moment ago, it couldn't have a blemish of any kind. A lot of, just make a side note, a lot of times we read in the Old Testament where the children of Israel, tried to bring sacrifices to God, and they had blemishes. They wanted to keep the best for themselves and give God, what was blemished, and, God would call them out on it,
Absolutely.
And one time he even said, why don't you take that and try to offer it to your your judges and so on and so forth, and see how you make out with that.
Right.
but God says that, of course God knew that they wouldn't do that. That evidently they was offering them the best, and God the things that were blemished. So. That's what takes place in those particular verses.
Absolutely. And then you're looking at towards the end, again, it was about the reason why they were to obey those commandments, as verse 32 says, so that they would not profane the name of God. And God says, my holy name, and so forth. So it was very important for the priests to adhere to these sacrifices the way that God pointed out. And then it brings us to chapter 23, John, and there we're looking at, again, the different feast days. And in these feast days, you would have certain orders that would be done, was to be done as well. For example, on the Sabbath day, they were to rest. They were to do no work. But really, it was a focus on God and who He is and what He has done. So really, it was beneficial for them to do this, that they would rest from their labors all that week, and then on the seventh day, then it was focused on God and doing His will, worshiping and praising Him, and all of these things. And that's what you're seeing here in chapter 23 at these feasts.
Yeah, in Leviticus 23 in verse 3 said, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And so the King James uses this word holy convocation, which simply means a holy assembly. And so they was coming together, like you said, to worship God, and to fulfill, of course, the command, because God commanded them to do this also.
Then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord, and here they were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days, as pointed out in verse 6. So you have all of these feast days that are mentioned here. Remember, even as we talked about in previous studies about the Day of Atonement, these things were involved as well, and they are important for Israel to follow because God is giving them these instructions, and what we're looking at, it had to be according to God's will, because that takes you really in the latter part when you talk about the Day of Atonement. That takes you in the latter part of chapter 23 as well, John, with all of the Feast of Booths and so forth, with all these different feasts that are described. And again, I would encourage you to look back at some of our earlier studies, and you would get more detail about this. But again, this was the responsibility of the priest who would be leading in the worship, because they were the religious leaders of the people, and they would be the one in regards to these sacrifices, offering these sacrifices. So when God gave the specificity of them, they had to make sure they were followed exactly as God said, or else one would be either cut off or they would lose their life in this process. So it was very important that they revered. Really, that's the whole idea, revering the name of God by obeying His instructions.
Then, of course, in verses 9 through 14, we have the Feast of First Fruits, which simply meant that when God blessed them, when it became harvest, I always like to use the example of like a tomato plant. You know, you see the green tomatoes come on, they ripen, and you go through and you pick them, but yet, you've still got, they keep ripening after that. But the first that you pick would belong unto God. That's what he's talking about there when he uses this particular term. And of course, it had to do sometimes it was called, I guess, the first fruit offering of first fruits by the congregation was in connection with the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, because the Feast of Pentecost was determined by counting 7 weeks from the time of the waving of this particular sheaf. Yeah. And so, and then we go on to the Feast of Weeks, and sometimes this was called the feast, or the day rather, of the first fruits, Numbers 28 verse 26, was also called the Feast of Harvest, Exodus 23 and verse 16. And in the New Testament, Acts 2 and verse 1, it's referred to as the day of Pentecost. And of course, that was determined by counting 7 Sabbaths or weeks from the Passover Sabbath. And so then you had 50 days, which that's what it was, 50 days after the day of first fruits, or the Feast of Weeks.
You know what's interesting about that, John, with the first fruits, you get to see where there is this. God had to get the first, so that's keeping God first. That's the whole point, of these feast days, is God is recognized because remember, He was the one that delivered them from Egyptian bondage. And so He would be the one that they should recognize because He is their God. So He gets the first fruit because of what He has done for them. And their appreciation to God would be, here, you get the first, Lord. And so you can see the worshiping of God as they were supposed to in those actions. And then you have, as you were talking about, John, even with the unleavened bread and everything, all of this is it's almost like the idea of fellowship with right. The God of heaven, the God that rescued them from Egyptian bondage. And so as you're keeping these things in mind, and God establishing this covenant and these instructions to Israel, and in particular as Leviticus is talking about the priests, then you know that as when they engage in worship, it was a worship to God. They're doing these things because the God of heaven, the one who delivered them, they're giving Him the praise and honor that He deserves. Because if it wasn't for Him, they would still be in bondage. Mm-hmm. And so that's they're right. Paying homage to the God of heaven. So important and so connected to these things as we're looking at these different feast days. Anything else, John, as we move on in connection to the other things that are mentioned, like in chapter 24, again, you're dealing with some of the laws of how it's dealing with one another, and in particular, again, the priests are the leaders, are the religious leaders, and how to handle certain things in situations that come about. Because when you're in a society, in society, there are going to be some things that need to be resolved. Mm-hmm. And here God gives instructions on how those things are to be resolved and how they are to be taken care of, establishing what we call today civilized society, but giving order. Giving order to them, and in giving order to them, they would then be actually carrying out the identity or the character of God, because He is a God of order. And because He's a God of order, they were to conduct themselves as such, because they were taking on His name. They were being identified with Him, especially as you're looking at some of the things concerning the lamp and the bread of the sanctuary, and as it talked about, oil. The olive oil, all of that. They play a very significant part in the worship, in the connection with God, with Israel and God, because again, we see that same concept, but in the spiritual sense under the new covenant. But it's spiritual, whereas under the old covenant, we get to see it physically, what this was all about and how it all connects, because these were representing the spiritual realm. And so, again, it was consistent and orderly.
Kind of like God's given us a picture.
Yes,
back
absolutely.
In the Old Testament of all this, and then how it relates later on. when everything is revealed in the New Testament.
Absolutely.
And we learn it all points backward in one sense, because all these things were shadows of something that was better to come.
Absolutely. So significant. And as I talked about, remember the laws there in chapter 24. Let me, just for an example, verse 17, if a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. And so here's the laws concerning human beings and the relationship with man. As we had mentioned earlier in previous study, John, we had talked about how the first 4 commandments are dealing with God, man's relationship to God, that they were to put no other God before him. And then the latter part of the commandments are talking about the relationship between fellow man. And here we're seeing some of these things being brought out in these chapters here in 24. Do you have any other thoughts in that, John? Or
No, I don't think I do.
And then you had mentioned earlier in chapter 25, you're talking about the year of Jubilee in the first few verses there. And what the year of Jubilee was is they had what they call the sabbatical years. And in the sabbatical years, 7 years, 6 years, they are working the land. And then on the 7th year, the land rests, everything rests. And then they would do that for seven sabbatical years. And then there was the year of Jubilee. And the things that, in reference to the Jubilee, everything went back, or people were released from their debts and the work. As we have been talking about these things, especially when you look there in chapter 25. And John mentioned about how that correlates to like the day of Pentecost. You have the day in the days here, the 49th day, and then the 50th. That's what Pentecost is. And what was interesting in chapter 2 of Acts, that was the preaching of the gospel, people obeying the gospel. You had the first fruits in reference to the gospel, all of that, all connected. But what we're seeing is the picture of all of these things back here in the book Leviticus in the Old Testament.
Just one thing.
Okay.
When we go back and look at the Sabbath year in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 10 through 13, we don't need to you can take the time to look at it, but as you said here, they worked the land for 6 days, and on the 7th day they rested. But what I found out was when you go over to Deuteronomy, the land, we know that giving the land rest really helps the land.
Absolutely.
But there was also something else going on, and that is during this 7th year, I find out in Deuteronomy 31, 10 through 11, that the emphasis during that year was put on teaching and training Israel. While the land was resting, there was more teaching and training Israel in God's law. And so I thought that was very interesting, because in Deuteronomy, again, chapter 31, and go back to the 9th verse, that the law was to be read every 7 years. And that equals at the time the land rested.
Right.
And, I don't know how long it would take to read it, or how much of it they read, but, God commanded it to be done.
Right.
And so I found that interesting, how that went together, like you was talking about, how these things kind of join together.
Yes.
It's very interesting.
It is. It really is. And John, and the reason why we've talked about some of these things like in previous lessons, but we're kind of going through them because really what we're connecting in connection to all the feast days and the year of Jubilee and these things being expressed. And I'm glad you brought out Deuteronomy 31, because really that's taking us to really chapter 26.
Okay.
Because chapter 26 is dealing with the blessings and the cursing
Right.
of the law, and God gave specificity to them to observe those things, and if they didn't, there were the cursings. Go ahead,
No,
John.
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and that's very important, because there were the blessings of obedience and there were the curses of disobedience, and that still remains a fact and a point for today. If we obey God, there are going to be blessings, but if we don't obey them, there's going to be cursings. And so we can see back here with Israel, God lays this out, and they are written for them to observe, because that was part of reading the law, as you were talking about, John, as well.
Yeah, it's interesting how this, the first thing God does in chapter 26, beginning with verse 1, he tells the Israelites that they're not to make any kind of, not make idols or carved images or sacred pillars or any kind of, anything engraved on stone or anything like that, because he says, and then he says, you're not to bow down to it. Why? And then why? He says, because I am the Lord, your God. And the word Lord here means the existing one. And the interesting thing about this that I find, a lot of times this is used in reference or contrast to idols,
Right.
because the idols are dumb.
Right.
And, in the Old Testament we find different times, God calling just basically they're dumb idols.
Right.
They can't talk, they can't see, they can't hear, they can't move. But yet men were building them and worshiping them, and then they had to carry them around.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But God says, I am the Lord, I am the existing one. And the word God here means the true God. And so I am the existing true God, right. Not your, these idols that you're worshiping.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so God is sole deity. And then in verse 2 he said, back again, he said, you need to keep my Sabbaths, in verse 2, and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. And so that was important. All the Sabbath day and the Sabbath rest, they had to be kept. Why? Because, God said so. And God is the one, of course, that gave the laws. Of course, the Sabbath day, remember the Sabbath day, and to keep it holy, we know that the Sabbath day was every seventh day or Saturday. That's when the Sabbath day took place. It was a day of rest, and they couldn't do no work on that day. And if somebody was caught, I believe you made mention there a while back when you was talking about somebody getting caught doing something that they could be cut off or killed. But we know that when this first happened, Moses went and said, okay, what do we do? And God said, kill him.
Right. Yeah.
And so God, God is a very severe and serious. People make fun about people being religious fanatics, but you can call it what it is, but I guess you'd have to call God a religious fanatic too, because people have the idea, that God is just full of grace and mercy, and you can just go out here and live the way you want to, and just God overlooks it, and He's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
But He will do something, and that's what we see. And then he talked about, you got to reverence the sanctuary, which was, of course, the tabernacle, the holy place, and the most holy place. And especially the most holy place, because that's where God came once a year on the Day of Atonement to meet with the high priest.
Right.
And he represented all the people. And then verses 3 through 13, we find here the promises of blessing for obedience unto God. In verse 3 begins by saying, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them. Now here's the interesting thing. Listen to what God says. Then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit, and your threshing shall reach unto the vintage, and the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time, and ye shall eat your bread to the full, and dwell in your land safely. And I will give you peace in the land, and ye shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I will rid evil beasts out of the land, neither shall the sword go through your land. And ye shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. And 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. And your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. For I will have respect unto you, and make you fruitful, and multiply you, and establish my covenant with you. And ye shall eat old store, and bring forth the old because of the new. And I will send my tabernacle, I will set my tabernacle before you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your God, and ye shall be my people. And then let's see here, verse 13, he says, I am the Lord your God. There's that phrase again, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. That's where over 1,000 gods existed down there in Egypt. That ye should not be their bondmen. And I have broken the bands of your yoke, and made you go upright. The key to this in verse 3, the King James starts with that little word if. Mm-hmm. And that's a conditional word.
That's
exactly
right.
If you do these things.
That's right.
But it was amazing, you stand there and, Moses is telling this to the people, and he's going to repeat it in the book of Deuteronomy. But, he's telling the people, here's what you need to do. Now, if you obey me, here's what's going to happen. I'll give you rain, and because of the rain, you'll have a harvest.
That's right.
And it'll go from one harvest to the next, and you'll have plenty. And he said, you won't have to worry. I can take 5 of you, and you can whip 100.
That's right.
And, God goes through here and gives all these blessings. But in order to get these blessings, they have to obey God.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a very important lesson.
Yeah. And that ties back to all those things that we were talking about earlier,
right,
John, in the feast days, making sure that they follow those prescribed instructions. The offering had to be the way that God had specified. And that would be obedience to Him. For them to take matters or do anything other than that, then it would be the disobedience. But as long as they were carrying out God's instructions, look at all the blessings that flowed upon them. And it didn't take many to defeat whatever enemies came their way.
Right. And verse 13 is interesting in the sense that God has promised, even though He said, I am the Lord your God, I brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that ye should not be their bondmen, that is, in slavery. And I have broken the bands of your yoke and made you go upright. So God is promising here to them, if they'll listen, you'll have freedom from slavery. But we know that as we go through the Old Testament, they didn't keep God's commandments.
That's right.
And there were times when they, God brought other nations against them, and some of them became slaves.
That's right.
And then finally, you know, God carried off the whole nation, and they was in slavery for a while. So, you know, this is really something to see how great God is, but yet there's conditions that must be met.
That's right.
And that's what people today fail to see.
Yes.
They fail to see the conditions that God has placed. Well, you can go to heaven, but there's a condition. You just can't run out here and, you know, live the way the way you want to live and do what you want to do.
I think that's a good note for us to stop on, John, and we'll pick up with this discussion on our next time, next Thursday at 7 p.m. when we spend a few moments with the Master. In the meantime, my friend, may God bless you as you continue to study His Word.